Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you all and also to learn from many of you. So I would like to begin this talk by sharing a real quick story of where I come from, Tucson, Arizona, because I think the situation there is very similar to the situation throughout the border region. So I've got two photographs there that show taken from the same place 100 years apart. The photograph on the left shows what it was like in Tucson about 100 years ago. There was much more abundant available water back then. The Santa Cruz River used to flow year-round. The water table was only 6 meters below the surface in many areas. We had abundant springs and artesian wells throughout the basin. We had this wonderful sponge-like riparian forest along the waterway that would absorb the rain when it fell. And in just 100 years, we've lost all that. We now consume or pump our groundwater at a rate that exceeds natural recharge. This has led to the dropping of the water table from just 6 meters below the surface to over 100 meters below the surface. And in many parts of the basin, it continues to drop. While we have overconsumed our groundwater at a rate that exceeds natural recharge, unfortunately, we've simultaneously crippled the watershed's ability to recharge itself by replacing the sponge of vegetation with a drain of pavement. So now when it rains, the bulk of the water drains away. So we've lost our river, we've lost our springs, we've lost the artesian wells and more. And then when it does rain, we have these horrible flood events and big rain events. And we're finding that the really big floods that used to occur every 100 years are now occurring every 10 years in some areas. But the rainfall pattern has not changed. The only thing that's changed is the condition of the watershed. We now have a drain-like surface rather than a sponge-like surface. But there's a good thing because there's a new sport called urban runoff kayaking. Okay? So as we deplete our groundwater and send our free rainwater out of the system, we have turned to importing huge amounts of water from elsewhere. We now import water from the Colorado River, which is over 480 kilometers away from Tucson. And Tucson is higher than the river. So we have to pump that water up over 1,000 meters. Water's very heavy. So it turns out that this canal that brings Colorado River water to Tucson and Phoenix is the single largest consumer of electricity in the entire state of Arizona. Since we burn coal to generate that electricity, it is also the single largest emitter of carbon in the state of Arizona. And perhaps the most depressing part for me anyway, is we've already killed one river, the Santa Cruz River that used to flow through Tucson. And now, Tucson, along with Phoenix, San Diego, Los Angeles, and many other communities that are drawing water from the Colorado, we're contributing to the death of a much larger river, the Colorado River. And not just that river, but also the Sea of Cortez, because so much of that sea life and its ecology is dependent on the fresh water and nutrient flows from the Colorado, which has basically ceased. So this depresses me. When I realize this story and look at this story, I think, wow, I, as a citizen of Tucson, Arizona, is it my role to continue to forward this degradation of my place, my river, the Colorado River, and a much larger region, just because I'm a citizen consuming water in that place? And that's too depressing a thought for me. I can't take it. So I say, no, that is not my role. And I say, this story I just told you of Tucson, That does not need to be the story of Tucson. We can look to another path. We can take another path. And I find hope in this statistic. It turns out that more rain falls on the surface of Tucson, Arizona in an average year of rain. More rain falls than all the inhabitants of Tucson consume of municipal water, utility water. And in Ciudad Juarez, it's not quite the same. You consume more water than falls from the sky, but there's still great hope because there's still the amount of rain that falls on Juarez in a year is more than half of what everyone in the city consumes of water in a year. So the trick is, how do we capture that rain when it falls so it's available when it's not falling? Well, there's many ways we can do this. The previous presentation showed you a number of those. But I see great hope in the top photograph. That's a photograph taken in along the highway to Tombstone, Arizona, where it's so dry you pretty much only see creosote plants, gobernadoras. Okay? But yet there's trees growing alongside the highway, where otherwise there are no trees growing. How is that possible? Because nobody planted those trees, nobody takes care of them, and nobody waters them. It's possible because of the rain running off the road increases the amount of available rain along that strip, tripling the available rainfall. Okay? So we can mimic that pattern. Okay? So around our buildings, we can plant the rain in bowl-like shapes in the landscape that capture the rainfall and the runoff. And in times of no rain around our homes, we can direct gray water, the water from our household sink, bathtub, shower, or washing machine. So these bowl-like shapes, they can become lush, vegetated gardens, rain gardens when it rains, and when it's not raining, gray water gardens. Not using any virgin imported water, but instead just using free on-site water. And at the same time, by doing that, we greatly reduce the amount of water flowing off-site and thus reduce flooding downstream. So here's the basic concept. Plant the rain. Okay? So I don't turn on the faucet. I just welcome what falls from the sky. That's the first step. So a rule for myself, I never plant a plant until I've planted the rain in earthwork shapes that will capture that rain, so that the rain can be my primary irrigation source. And I start with using rainwater as irrigation because I don't need to filter it to drink. I'm giving it to the plants. Okay? And rainwater is the best water for any plant. It does not contain salts, okay, like our groundwater, our city water does. And in fact, when there's a lightning storm, it contains nitrogen, so it's free fertilizer for the plants. After the rain, when everything turns green, it's for 3 reasons. The rain gives water. 2, the rain flushes the salts out of the root zone. And 3, the rain gives free fertilizer. That's great! Okay? Why are we getting rid of that? Sorry. Okay. And in the United States, 30 to 70% of the drinking water that we have paid all kinds of money to filter and deliver to every home at drinking water quality, we put it in the dirt. Because 30 to 70% of the drinking water we consume is just used to irrigate plants. Why are we using drinking water to irrigate the plants? Let's use the rain. So, I see we can take one of 2 paths. The path to scarcity on the left or the path to abundance on the right. On the path to scarcity, we turn resources into wastes. We turn the rain, the best water there is, into a waste that we send down the drain. Whereas in the abundance path, we use the rain as our primary water source. Free water source. On the path to scarcity, we rely on the imported resources that we have to pay for. So it gets more expensive. We pay for water that we import. We pay for fertilizer that we buy. Whereas on the path to abundance, we're using the free rainwater, the free gray water, the free water coming off the street. Okay? And we grow our own fertilizer. So on the path to scarcity, we consume more than we produce. We're consuming this water we import. We're consuming the fertilizer. We're consuming the time we have to work more to pay for all this. Whereas on the path to abundance, we can grow shade that reduces our electric bills and our cooling bills. We can grow food. We can grow flood control. We can grow beauty. Okay? We can grow a more beautiful place in which we want to live and interact with our neighbors. And finally, on the path to scarcity, it's disintegrated drains. We're sending our rainwater off our roofs. We're sending the rainwater off our streets into the drain. We're sending the gray water from our household drains out of the system. It's all leaving. Whereas on the path to abundance, we're capturing all those and feeding them into the landscape to grow free shelter, beauty, food, and much more. So how do we do this? Well, this is how my brother and I did it on our small urban lot. The above image is before, the below image is after. So even though we're only on an eighth of an acre, that's 0.05 of a hectare, we are able to harvest over 379,000 liters of rainwater a year in an average year just on that small urban lot and the surrounding public right-of-way. That's all free water, okay? And we take even more water than that off of the surrounding street, which I'll show you in a moment. So on the left, upper left is before, lower right is after, okay? All the plants that you see there are irrigated only with rainwater and street runoff. No drinking water. Okay? So the great thing is when we moved to this neighborhood and bought this property, it was so hot outside and barren, you didn't want to talk to your neighbor. So there was a lot of crime because you didn't know who is your neighbor and who is a criminal because you didn't know anybody. You never went outside. Okay? But now, because we've grown this oasis with free on-site water, crime has dropped. Because everyone loves to be outside. So you see your neighbor all the time and you say hello. Okay, there's more friendly eyes on the street. What's more, back when there was almost no vegetation, the only wildlife we had were exotic pigeons. Now, there's over 24 native birds that have returned. Because 90% of the plants we planted are native to the Tucson Basin. We chose native plants because they are the best adapted to the local rainfall pattern and the local droughts and dry season. So it's very easy to have success. But what's more, that native plant life, that's the natural habitat of the native bird life and other animals. So as we have regrown their habitat in the urban core, the wildlife has returned. So we are daily reconnected with the Sonoran Desert ecosystem and what makes this place unique and special. And we forget how dramatic the change has been. Unless I give these talks, I'm reminded when I see the photograph. So we put a before sign, a sign with a before photograph on it at the same place where I took that before photo. So now all my neighbors, new neighbors, old neighbors, and visitors can see the change that has occurred. And I think this is so important that we remind ourselves what change is possible. Because all too often we get stuck thinking that what's happening now is the way it's always been and it always will be. And that's not true. Okay? If things are bad, we can make them better. We just have to act. So this sign was put here as the motivation to encourage neighbors and others to act. And we're finding many are. So we've learned a lot of lessons as we've done this. One of these lessons is it's very important with this green infrastructure, these living systems, that we need to start at the top of the watershed and work down. Now, so often, we want to start capturing water at the bottom of the watershed, where we see the flooding occurring and all the water gathering. But that's not the place to begin with green infrastructure, because green infrastructure is simple strategies that anyone can do, just with their own shovel. So it's important we start at the top, where there's less volume of water, so it's easier to capture it. And what we're doing is we're starting at the source. We're addressing the problem at the source, not trying to put a big bandage on at the bottom, where that bandage is going to blow out. Okay? So we started on our property, because we're at the high point. Water used to flow off the property into the street or into the house. Now, we've redirected the water to plantings, to the landscape. And no water flows to the street. After we did that, we started to direct water from the street to street-side basins, which I'll show you in a moment. The next lesson we learned is some of the easiest self-maintaining street-side basins are in a shape of a backwater or an eddy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, here, actually, I jumped ahead of myself. The lesson here is that we can capture much more water when we have rainfall and runoff from a hard surface. So we can double or triple the available rainfall, because we have the rain falling from the sky that we capture in the basin. Then we can also capture the water running off the street or the roof next to the basin. And if that area is 2 or 3 times the area of the basin, we can double or triple available rainfall. So, in a typical neighborhood street in Tucson, in 1 year of rain, we can harvest over 3 million liters of rainfall per kilometer per year. Over 3 million liters per kilometer per year. If we don't send that rainwater to the storm drain, but instead send it to street-side plantings. And we cut the curb to allow the street runoff into the street-side basin. So the street irrigates the street trees for free while controlling flooding. There's a number of ways we can do this. We started where the raised curb was depressed, where there used to be a driveway for cars. So what we simply did is we dug basins to either side of the dip in the curb, where the driveway used to be. And we extended those basins into the dipped area of the curb. And you can see how much water we're capturing in a storm, and how fun it is. My nephew and I love to run out in our bathing suit and run with the water. And a number of our neighbors are starting to do the same thing. Okay. You can also cut the curb if there is no depressed area. Now, when we first started doing this, it was illegal to cut the curb in Tucson. So we cut the curb on a Sunday morning when no one from the city was watching. And we were very careful to try and make a very straight, clean cut. We did not want to damage public property. We wanted to improve public property. And we only did one curb cut, not a lot, because we wanted to first see if it worked. And then if it didn't, we wanted to fix our mistakes before we continued. And we made sure this curb cut was at the highest point in the watershed. So we were dealing with a small amount of water. We would not create a catastrophe. Now it's legal to cut the curb if you get a city permit. And this was legalized in 2007, I believe. And I'll let Irene from the city talk more about that. But it's been wonderful that there's been this huge shift. Something that was illegal is now legal and promoted, incentivized. I'll let Irene speak to that. Okay, and if you don't have the money for a curb cut, a less expensive option is a curb core hole. Okay? The only problem is, since it's a smaller opening, it's more likely to clog. But as long as you are there in a rainstorm, it's very easy to unclog it. Okay. Now, a lot of people, when they first hear about green infrastructure, these simple rain gardens, they think that they can't harvest much water. But I have found they can harvest a huge amount of water. So Tucson just got an 1.5 inch rainstorm last week. So what's that? 35 millimeter rain? Is that right? And I decided, I got a little greedy and a little curious. I wanted to take the water from the other side of the street and direct it to my side of the street. Because my side of the street only gets a little water, whereas the other side of the street gets a lot of water from a student housing parking lot and much more area. So you can see I put wood in the street, 2x4s, 4x4s, 4x6s, and made a quick temporary dam. Now, what this shows you is, on the left, in red, is my brother and I's property. In the light blue, the turquoise blue, is the area of street that normally drains to our street side basins. But the larger blue area to the right is the larger watershed whose water I diverted across the street to my side of the street. So basically, I expanded our watershed by over 6 times. Okay? And thus I turned a 1.5 inch rain into the equivalent rainfall volume of well over a 1,000-year rain event. Hope this is making sense. Okay? So now we're looking the other direction. The water's coming in, it hits my little wood dam on the right, it goes over to the left-hand side on the left, and we are getting all of the water! Okay? So hopefully you can see water's flowing along the street curb on the left in front of the truck. But look behind the truck. No water's flowing along the curb, because all those simple street-side basins are infiltrating all the water, despite the fact that we've upped the volume to a 1,000-year event. Okay? Now, in the very end of the storm, finally all our basins filled up, and they overflowed, but still the water was not lost. Because if you see the telephone pole, that's the other side of the telephone pole is our last basin. But if you look to the right, you see 2 more basins. Those are the neighbors' basins, and they are capturing the overflow. So the system gets even more resilient when you work as a community. So a big lesson that we learned here is these basins work really well when they act as backwaters or eddies. So what do I mean by that? I mean that the inflow point is also the overflow point. And we purposely put the curb cut on the high side of the flow. So if the water's flowing this way, the curb cut is as far in that direction as we can go on the basin. This way, there's no erosion. Instead, we capture leaf drop on the street. So the rainfall events clean the street as water flows off the street into the basin. All the mulch, the organic matter in our basin, sticks in the basin. It does not flow away. Okay? If we had one inlet on one side and an overflow on the other side, there would be potentially more erosion as water moves through. It's a flow-through system. This is just a backwater system. Here you can see one of the basins working. So the upper side of the basin, just past the barrel cactus, is the inlet. Water fills the basin. You see all the organic matter in there? It's not flowing away. It's just floating. And once the water infiltrates, the organic matter goes back down. Another lesson we learned is it's important that at the inlet of a curb cut we have a drop, okay, of at least about 50 millimeters, so that we create a waterfall effect. And when the water falls over that edge, it speeds up. So any detritus or organic matter the water's carrying moves into the basin, instead of creating a dam at the inlet, which would stop the water from coming in. Okay? The next lesson we learned is we have to pay attention to elevations. We need to make sure our basin is lower than the street, because water flows downhill. And all too often I've seen people put in basins that are higher than the street. They don't work. Then we want to make sure we don't flood adjoining properties. So we make the pathway next to the property line an inch or 2 inches or 25 to 50 millimeters higher than the top of the street curb. So if water is going to flow anywhere, it's back to the street, never into the adjoining property. But we don't want to make the path too high. Otherwise, it makes the basin feel very low in relationship to the path. But that doesn't, we don't want it to feel dangerous to the people walking along the path. Okay, we want it to feel safe. And that's why we also make little planting terraces to the side of the pathway. It doesn't make the drop feel so steep. Okay, then the next lesson we learned is life is what makes these systems work. We need to have vegetation to uptake and utilize the water. And the more roots that grow in the soil, the more quickly water infiltrates. The more trees grow and shade the area, the more their leaves can evapotranspire the water, while also shading and cooling us to reduce the water loss to evaporation in the dry, hot times. And it's so important with these living systems that we feed the life in the soil. So when we prune trees, we cut up the prunings and put them back under the trees in the basin. Because the leaves, the organic matter of the branches, the prunings, that is the primary food source of the soil and the soil life. And we, through studies at the University of Arizona done by Mitch Pavo-Zuckerman, have found that when we have lots of that organic mulch in the basins that are capturing street runoff, we can bioremediate or naturally filter over 10 times the pollutants that a rock-mulched basin could filter. Because the rock doesn't feed the microorganisms in the soil, whereas the carbon, the leaves, the prunings do. And if 12 to 14% of the waste stream of a typical city is yard prunings, why is that a waste? If there is a waste in any system, there's a problem. So we're turning that green waste into a natural filter and a soil food, okay, which is improving the performance of the whole system. Now, a lot of times cities will say, we don't have the money to prune the trees and to care for the trees. So this is why we have free pruning workshops in our neighborhood and open to the community, so that the people living in the neighborhood can be the citizen foresters. They know how to prune the trees living in front of their home. And then they can cut up the prunings and put them under the trees and the tree basins in front of their home. And we have this program where after the pruning workshop, people can put all the prunings on the side of the street, and then we'll hire a chipper shredder service to come and chip up the prunings. And they put the chipped wood back on the curb. So people can then take that mulch and put it under their trees. Nothing leaves the neighborhood. It all sticks around. But when you keep saving all your biomass, it builds up. Okay? But thankfully, if you put the biomass where the water is, the rate of decomposition is faster. So it stays in balance. But we've found we're able to dramatically increase the storage capacity of our basins and the ability to use that mulch if we use the strategy of vertical mulching. So under the woman standing in that mulched basin, under her feet, we dug the basin an additional 2 feet, about this much deeper under the mulch. And we packed it full of more prunings from the neighborhood trees. So thereby we increased the capacity of the basin by 3 times without increasing the risk of someone drowning. Because you can stand on top of the mulch. You can't drown. Even if you shove your face in the mulch, you can't drown. Okay? And then there's all that carbon matter, which is more food for the soil, more filtering of the toxins coming off the street, and so on. And it's so important, here's our last lesson, that all of these strategies be done in such a way that we are maximizing the health and the wealth of all the citizens living with these systems and the wildlife, the plant life, all the life. So you see a photograph of an intersection before the work, and then we put in a traffic circle in the middle that captures the rain. We planted it with the neighbors, volunteer labor, so more people are invested in it. They put their work in it. They want to see it succeed. And now you can see all the lush vegetation growing in it. This has slowed traffic. It's made the street safer because there's not so many speeding cars. Now more people ride their bikes with the children on the back of the bike. They walk, they skateboard. Their health improves. Alongside the street, in front of the stop signs and the yield signs, thanks to a Pima County Neighborhood Reinvestment Grant, we were able to remove asphalt and put in water harvesting basins within the street that further slows traffic but also captures the water. And with just 10 of these traffic circles, 33 of these pullouts, and 85 street-side basins with curb cuts, we've been able to harvest over 2.5 million liters of water that used to leave the site. Now that was my first volume calculation. I've since found that we're harvesting 3 times that water when we can harvest 3 times that water if we get above normal rainfall years. Okay. Okay. So all this vegetation growing in the street and along the street is so important when it helps to shade the street and mitigate the heat island effect. Mitigate all that heat being absorbed by the asphalt of the street. So because this not only makes things more comfortable and pleasant for us, this not only reduces our cooling bills because we're cooling for free with the shade, but this also reduces water loss. So in red there, I have the Ciudad Juarez's annual rainfall, 310 millimeters a year. That's your free rainwater income. That's what you get for free. But how much do you lose each year, potentially, to evaporation? Well, if you have a standing body of water, that can be over 1,700 millimeters of rain a year that you can lose to evaporation. So this tells us that we need to do anything and everything we can to reduce evaporative loss of the water we have. We can do this by shading with vegetation, shading the soil with mulch, creating windbreaks to reduce water loss to wind shear. And it's so important, too, to grow more than shade. So we select food-producing plants to grow along our streets that we irrigate with street runoff. Now, we don't grow garlic and tubers, potatoes, and we don't grow leafy greens and corn, okay, because they all uptake toxins that are coming from the street. So we concentrate instead on planting food-bearing perennial plants, woody plants, like trees and shrubs. And studies at the University of Arizona have found the toxins from the street runoff don't get into the food of the woody perennial plants. Okay? Here we're also harvesting the cactus fruit. And this is great because we're able to grow food right outside our door without any imported water. Just wastewater from the street. Okay? And this is a great excuse to spend more time along the street when you're harvesting that fruit. And then if you spend more time outside on the street, you're more likely to see a neighbor. And you might actually say hello to the neighbor. You might actually get to know that neighbor's name. You might start to feel like you live in a community because you talk to each other. Okay? And then things get better. So we wanted to improve upon this even more. We wanted more people to be able to harvest these foods. But many people have forgotten how to harvest the native foods. So this nonprofit I formed, Desert Harvesters, we created a cookbook that shows people how to process these traditional foods. We also found that if you want to eat the mesquite pods, the pechitas from the mesquite tree, it's laborious if you grind it by hand. So we got a hammer mill that we put on a trailer that we take to different neighborhoods so people can grind up the pods into flour very quickly. And this is naturally sweet, healthy flour. It's great for people with hypoglycemia or diabetes because the food slows the intake of sugar. So it's like a medicine food that tastes great. And we can sell it for $14 a pound. So it's a cash crop. And we've timed ourselves picking the pods, grinding the pods, and selling the flour at neighborhood events. And we can make $25 an hour, never leaving the neighborhood. So this is creating an economic neighborhood engine. But it's also creating a city economic engine. Because once a year we have this big festival where we show people how to harvest the rain and process these foods, the mesquite and whatnot. And we have mesquite pancakes with prickly pear syrup. And people come from all over to try it and to see what it's like. And they get excited, like the guy in that photograph. And they want to do likewise. So we show them how, so they can make these same changes in their neighborhoods. Because the majority of what I've shown you wasn't done by a business or the city. The majority of this was done by neighborhood volunteers. And then once we got the county grant, we worked with the help of the city and city contractors to do the work in the street. Whereas alongside the street, most of the work was done by neighbors. So many people now, we've got people flying in from Canada and Mexico to eat these pancakes at our fiestas. Okay, I think that's crazy to travel that far for a pancake. And then when you look at the carbon skid mark of flying that far for a meal, it's crazy. But the fact is people are coming to eat these. And that they then spend more time in Tucson at the hotels, at other restaurants, so it feeds the Tucson economy. And my last slide is I think it's so important that we show the flow. So much of our infrastructure is hidden. The storm drains, once the water goes in the storm drain, we don't know where the water goes. When we turn on the faucet, we don't know where the water comes from. And since we don't know, we can't act to change things. So we're going out of our way to do everything on the surface where we can see it, we can learn from it, we can replicate it. Okay? And we also on the surface want to tell a larger story. So these fish, this sculpture of fish, they're the Sonora suckerfish, which you used to be able 100 years ago to fish out of the Santa Cruz River, the river that used to flow through Tucson all year long. So it used to be you could walk from my house 100 years ago and you could fish your dinner and then take a swim. Now all that is lost because we've killed the river because of our water mismanagement. That's the depressing story. But within that fish sculpture is a horned lizard. Why is a horned lizard within the fish? Because the horned lizard has adapted to the dry conditions it lives in. And it has evolved to literally harvest rainwater off its back. So when it rains, the horned lizard lifts its rear legs, it flares out its back to maximize the surface area of its roof, its back. And the rainwater travels through microscopic gutters between its scales directly to its mouth. So the horned lizard is telling us, hey, we can harvest that rain instead of draining it away. And that's why the sculpture is located within a traffic calming, water harvesting chicane within the neighborhood. Because it's our hope that this will show the way to more people in our community to plant, invest, and harvest the rain instead of draining it away, in the hopes that someday our river will flow again. Thank you. And lastly, check out the books. They'll be for sale afterward out in the lobby. And also check out the website for lots of free info.